I'm Peter Singer, and I want to begin by congratulating everybody involved in the founding of the China Vegan Society. I'm excited to learn about this development. I think it's very important that if the world is to make progress in reducing the suffering of animals and in reducing the impact of livestock raising on climate change, and also in reducing the risks of further pandemics, since so many of them have come from factory farms, I think it's really important that we work together with China's involvement in reducing and eventually perhaps eliminating the consumption of meat and other animal products. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how I came to the views that I hold about animals, and may not be the same path as you have taken, but I think that it does raise some philosophical points that we can use in this discussion. So in 1970, I was 24 years old, and I was a graduate student at the University of Oxford. And I don't think up to that time I had ever met or talked to a vegetarian. That may sound rather strange today because there are so many vegetarians around, but certainly in the society where I grew up in Australia before going to England for my postgraduate studies. There were very, very few vegetarians. I might possibly have met an Indian who was a Hindu and a vegetarian for that reason, but obviously I was not a Hindu and that was not going to appeal to me. Uh, there were probably some people who were vegetarians because they thought it was important for their health not to eat meat, but I didn't have any such belief of that kind. Uh, and maybe there were some absolute pacifists who thought it's always wrong to kill in war, but also to kill animals. But I don't recall meeting any. So I didn't really think very much about the ethical issues of how we ought to treat animals, even though I was, by this time, specializing in ethics. I'd studied philosophy and history as an undergraduate in Melbourne, but when I went to Oxford, I specialized in ethics and political philosophy. But somehow the treatment of animals didn't seem to be a important ethical issue. At that time, the important ethical issues were the war in Vietnam, questions about racism and racial equality, uh, questions about nuclear weapons. They were obviously very important. And around that time, I started to become interested in questions about global poverty and what people who were living in affluent countries, as I was, should be doing to help people in desperate circumstances, in extreme poverty, or perhaps in refugee camps as refugees from persecution. But animals really didn't make it onto that uh, list of most important ethical issues. Things changed for me when, quite by chance, I happened to have lunch with a Canadian graduate student called Richard Keshen, and I noticed that when we were choosing what we would have for lunch, he asked if the spaghetti, which had a sort of brown sauce on top of it, had meat in it. And when he was told the sauce did have meat in it, he took a salad plate without meat. Um, so I asked him why he had asked that question and why he didn't eat meat. As I say, this was something really unusual at that time. And he said, he gave a very simple answer. He said, uh, I don't think it's right to treat the animals the way they get treated in order to be turned into meat. And, I was eating meat at that particular moment, of course. Um, And I asked him for more details because I thought that animals have good lives generally on farms, that they're out in the fields grazing, uh, that they're protected from predators, they have enough food. Of course, I knew that they get slaughtered, but I thought, well, at least they have a good life, and then they have one bad day when they get trucked to slaughter and killed. Uh, that's not very nice, I'm sure, but I thought that perhaps on balance that was okay. Admittedly, I hadn't thought very much at all about the moral status of animals because, as I said, that didn't seem such an important issue. But Richard told me no. Many animals already then in 1970 were being taken indoors and were living all their lives crowded inside very large sheds with thousands, or in the case of chickens, even tens of thousands of others of their species. And that their lives were really quite miserable because nothing really mattered except the productivity of the unit and how cheaply the meat or eggs or milk could be produced. And that was compatible with quite a lot of suffering of the animals. Um, Eventually, I did read a bit about this. I read a book called Animal Machines by Ruth Harrison, which I think was the first book written about factory farming from an animal point of view. And I learnt that although farmers sometimes tell you that if their animals were not content, they wouldn't produce well, that's just not true. The economics of factory farming don't take the well-being of individual animals into account. Uh, you can often get more animals dying from overcrowding, but still make a larger profit because you've got more animals actually in your unit and more surviving at the end, even if more of them have died on the way. So this was a revelation to me, and I started thinking about why are we justified to treat animals this way? The way I framed the question was this: we say that all humans are equal, that all humans have equal rights, human rights, and that there's a kind of equality of status. We shouldn't discriminate against humans on the ground of their race or sex or religion. But why does the boundary stop at our species? Why is just being a member of our species enough to give you rights and enough to give you a high moral status uh, when no being outside our species has that status? And why is this true for all humans, irrespective of their mental level, of their cognitive abilities? Because we didn't deny human rights to intellectually disabled humans or to infants who hadn't developed the abilities to have proper understanding of their situation and of the world. So why do we assume that they are superior in status to other animals which have greater cognitive abilities? I began to see this as a form of speciesism. Uh, I didn't invent that word. I took it from somebody else I met in Oxford around that time called Richard Ryder. But he used it to make the parallel between racism, the way we treat other races or have treated other races in the past, for example, during the slave trade, and sexism, the way in which men have treated women, or more or less as pieces of property, and speciesism, the way we still today treat animals as pieces of property, quite literally, and can enslave them to lock them in wire cages, for example, to produce eggs for us. So it was that um, started me thinking about that there was something seriously wrong with the way we're treating animals, and that we really needed to change that. And that's what led me to, to write Animal Liberation. It came out in 1975, so it took me some years to write that, to complete it, but I'm very pleased that it has remained in print ever since. And in fact, right now I'm just beginning to work on a new revision of it because the main text has not been revised since 1990 and it definitely needs updating. So that's why, as I say, I came to the views that I hold about animals. I hope that some of you will hold them. I think it's significant that they are based on universal ethical principles, the idea of concern for the suffering of others, concern for the well-being of others, and rejecting the idea that the term others only covers members of our species. Uh, so I think anybody can come to this view. It doesn't depend on any particular religious beliefs. As I already said, for example, Hindus may be vegetarians, but for very different reasons from my own. I know that some Buddhists are vegetarians too, though actually I think not as many as should be if you take seriously the precepts of the Buddhist religion. But uh, my reasons are not exactly Buddhist either, although certainly the idea of compassion, which is so important in Buddhism, is something that I value as well, and that can lead us to treat animals better and to avoid eating them. So that's the main reason why I think we should be vegan. Uh, there are other reasons, as I mentioned, the very large contribution that raising animals makes to greenhouse gas emissions, particularly cattle, whether beef cattle or dairy cattle, and sheep. The ruminant animals make the greatest emissions, but others also make a significant contribution to climate change. And the spread of viruses from factory farms was confirmed in the case of the 2009 swine flu pandemic. We've also had avian flu epidemics. And many experts say that crowding thousands or tens of thousands of animals together in a shed, stressing them, which means that they have weaker immune systems, and it's so easy for viruses to leap from animal to animal, to mutate, and then because there are humans working with these animals, to be transmitted to a human and cause another deadly pandemic. And that's quite apart from eating wild animals, which is also, of course, very dangerous and may be the cause of the current 2020 pandemic. That's really the main thing that I want to say. I do want to say that I think China is an extremely important country, obviously, by its sheer size, by the number of animals being raised in China at the moment. Um, but I believe that it's possible for China to change. I have visited China, and my most recent visit was to promote the current new translation of Animal Liberation. And I spoke at that time to a lot of journalists and other people, and I was impressed with the understanding of the arguments that I was putting forward and with the readiness to accept that there is something in them. Of course, I know that there are cultural factors that lead people to want to keep eating meat. Um, there are status factors that people think that it's a sign of success that you can afford to eat a lot of meat. So I know it will take a long time. But I hope that eventually people do move to plant-based foods, or at least I would say, if not to plant-based foods, then perhaps eventually we will get forms of cellular meat or cultured meat. Now you might say, well, that's not vegan, and of course, you may well choose not to eat it. I don't think that I would particularly want to eat cultured meat, but I do think that it would be a good thing if it were to catch on and be a way in which uh, people who might not otherwise stop eating meat would nevertheless stop eating meat from whole animals, meat from suffering beings. And in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, it would also be much reduced from cellular meat, and there would be no animals to spread the viruses. So I would accept that as a compromise, if you like, a kind of not exactly vegan, but still animal-free diet. And possibly that holds some hope for the future as well. In any case, I certainly wish the China Vegan Society, a successful launch and a rapid growth and an increase in public opinion about not eating animals and in the practice that follows that. Thank you very much.